Hello, everyone, and welcome to the WHN broadcast. I'm your host, Karen Ruby. Today we have a special guest. We have Jose Jimenez today, and we're going to talk about airborne transmission. The first question we have is, how does airborne transmission work?
Okay. So the airborne transmission basically means that we are going to have a virus that's floating in the air and we're going to inhale it. That's the short version. The slightly longer version is you have two people that may be talking, for example, and then the person who's infected is going to exhale some aerosols. And this is like it's going to exhale some smoke. But it's just the smoke is not visible because there's too little of it, even though, then it's infectious. So then it's going to float in the air. And, sometimes you're talking to someone, the smoke goes to the left, to the right, but sometimes you're going to inhale it. And then some of the time when you inhale that air that has been exhaled by someone who's infected, you can then become infected yourself. That's kind of transmission in close proximity. But it can also happen when you share the air in a room. So you may be in a choir practice, in a class, or in a party, or whatever. And then the person that's exhaling the virus may not be next to you. But it's the same as if there was someone who was smoking somewhere else in the room. They may be exhaling the virus, and you still smell that smoke, right? And you can still get infected in that situation. Less likely that can also happen outdoors, especially if you are close, or if you are in an outdoor place that's outdoors, but really there is walls and it limits the flow of air, so the air gets trapped. So that will be how it works. But at the end, you have to inhale the virus, and is different than what they told us at the beginning of the pandemic, that it was our hands and we were touching ourselves. That we now know is very little importance for this virus. Or these projectiles that someone's going to cough, and then these projectiles are going to hit you in the eye, whatever. That also, can happen, but it's not how this virus is surviving and thriving.
Why do you think it's such a challenge to get airborne transmission accepted?
That is a difficult and interesting question, and I have thought a lot about it and discussed it with other scientists and policymakers, and I will give you my best interpretation. I think there is one reason, which is history, which during all of human history until basically 1900, we thought that diseases mostly went through the air. And around that time, it was discovered, cholera goes through water and malaria goes through mosquitoes and purple fever goes through the hands. And these were diseases that forever we have thought for millennia that they were going through the air. So then it is realized that that's not the case. And there is a movement within the medical community to say, well, maybe this air transmission was a superstition. And then suddenly the 20th century until the COVID pandemic is like, oh, the airborne transmission is very, very difficult. So all the medical doctors, all the public health officials have been educated in this is something that's very, very unlikely. There's only a few diseases like tuberculosis and measles, but otherwise it's very difficult. So that is one reason. But then that's not the only reason. I think the second reason is that it is very inconvenient. It's inconvenient to power. Talking clearly, both, if you get infected because you didn't wash your hands, it's your fault. There is no liability for anyone. Now, if you get infected in your office, in your school, whatever, because you inhaled that air and that air had a pathogen, that's something that could have been prevented by measures that your office or your school, whatever, could have taken. And they have a liability. So both to save that expense and to save the liability and just our society, and partially because of their history, our buildings are not ready for urban transmission. We thought this was not important, therefore we don't have enough ventilation, and this is in all the countries and in all the buildings and even in the White House. And so this is, I think, if we simplify it boils down to those two reasons.
That's really interesting. And the final question we have for today is, what should we be doing to stay safe?
So in terms of staying safe, the most helpful thing, in my opinion, is to think about how transmission happens. Some people are exhaling an invisible smoke, and you just don't want to breathe that smoke, breathe air from others. You don't know who's infected. It may be someone who doesn't have symptoms. So you want to minimize how much of that you do. So something that is generally pretty safe is to do things outdoors. If you can meet outdoors, talk outdoors, go to restaurants outdoors if the weather is good, that works well. Then something that also works very well and that we recommend doing is wearing a mask. If it's a mask that is a good filter material and that fits well to your face, that doesn't leave any gaps, like a good N95 that has the straps behind your neck, that can work very well. And I wear that indoors still all the time. And but then besides that, we can do one more thing, which is to try to clean the air indoors. So, and there are basically three ways to do it. One way is we try to make indoors more like outdoors. So we open the windows, for example, we use a ventilation system, and that virus that's in the air, as well as the air, we just put them outside. Then the second thing that we can do is we're going to keep the air indoors, but we're going to remove the virus, and that's called filtration. So we have a filter, like a HEPA filter or a Corsi Rosenthal box, and the air with a fan is being passed through the filter, and that traps the virus, right? And then you no longer breathe it. The third thing that we can do is what we call disinfection. The virus is going to stay floating in the air, but we're going to try to kill it. Now you're still going to inhale that virus, but it's going to be dead and it's no longer going to infect you. That can be done with UV lights. It can be done with other methods, with chemicals. In general, we don't recommend that. It's only for some specialized situations. So ventilation and filtration is what the experts recommend.
Really helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jose. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.